My mother-in-law held the envelope up at the gift table in front of 26 people, and she said, "Oh, look, it's from Claire," and she said it the way people say things when they have already decided what they think. And her sister leaned over and said, "Is that all?" And my mother-in-law said, "Well, it's a card at least." And someone laughed, and my husband's cousin said, "Claire always was a bit careful with money." And I was standing 8 feet away, holding a glass of champagne, and I heard every word, and I did not move, and I did not respond. And I watched my mother-in-law slide her finger under the envelope flap, and I watched her open it, and I watched her pull out the card, and I watched a folded document fall out of the card onto the gift table. And she picked it up, and she unfolded it, and she read it, and the table went quiet, and she read it again. And her sister said, "What is it?" Barbara and my mother-in-law said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "It's a property deed," and her sister said, "A what?" And she said, "Claire has put a piece of land in my son's name," and the table was completely silent, and I took a sip of my champagne, and I thought about the 18 months I had spent finding that piece of land, and the 3 years I had spent saving for it. And I thought about every comment Barbara had made about my financial situation since the day I had married her son, and I thought, this is a good champagne, and I let the silence do everything else. Hey everyone, welcome in. Okay, so new people, old people, I am so glad you are all here for this one specifically because this story ends at a gift table and begins about 4 years before that, and every single part of it matters, so stay with me. My name is Claire Weston, and I am 34 years old, and I have been married to my husband Tom for 3 years, and Tom's mother Barbara is a woman who has very clear ideas about what things are worth, and those ideas extend to people. And from the first dinner I attended at Barbara's house 4 years ago, she had placed me in a specific category which was not enough, and the not enough was communicated in the specific language that mothers-in-law use when they want to communicate something, without being accountable for having communicated it, and Barbara's language sounded like this. At the first dinner, she had asked me what I did, and I had said I work in land acquisition for a development consultancy, and she had said, "Oh, that sounds complicated," and I had said, "It's interesting work," and she had said, "Tom has always needed someone steady," and I had processed the word steady and understood it as the companion to not ambitious, and I had smiled and passed the bread. And at our engagement party, Barbara had told her sister within my earshot that Tom could have done very well for himself, and her sister had said, "He seems happy." Barbara had said, "Happiness isn't everything, dear." And at our wedding, Barbara had given a toast that had included the line, "We don't always get the life we planned, but we make the best of what we have." And Tom had squeezed my hand under the table, and I had squeezed back. And I had looked at Barbara, and I had thought about the piece of land I had been looking at for 6 months, and I had thought, not yet. What Barbara knew about my financial situation was the surface of it, which was that I drove a practical car and lived in a practical apartment before Tom and I moved in together, and did not wear expensive things, and did not talk about money. And what Barbara did not know was why. And the why was this. I had grown up watching my mother make very careful decisions with very limited resources, and I had inherited both the carefulness and a deep conviction that the way money looks and the way money works are 2 entirely different things. And I had been working in land acquisition since I was 24, and I understood land the way some people understand stocks or art, which is as an asset class that rewards patience and specificity. And I had been acquiring my own small pieces of it since I was 26, quietly and without discussion, and by the time I married Tom at 31, I had 3 parcels of land in different states, and a savings discipline that Barbara would have found baffling if she had known about it, and she did not know about it, because I had not told her, and I had not told her because I had understood from the first dinner that Barbara had already written the version of me she intended to keep, and additional information would not update it. It would just be absorbed into the existing portrait. And I had decided that the portrait would correct itself eventually. And I had been thinking about when and how for about 2 years when Tom's brother announced his engagement. Tom's brother Michael was getting married to a woman named Diane, who came from a family Barbara approved of thoroughly and visibly, and the engagement party planning and the wedding planning had been accompanied by a running commentary from Barbara about what a lovely family Diane came from and how well matched they were. And at a family dinner 4 months before the wedding, Barbara had said, "I always hoped both my boys would find the right fit," and she had looked at me when she said it in the specific way that gives a comment, 2 meanings simultaneously. And Tom had said, "Mom," and she had said, "What I'm just saying, I'm happy for Michael," and I had said, "We're all happy for Michael, Barbara." and I had picked up my fork and I had gone home that evening, and I had called my land broker, and I had said, I'm ready to move on the Vermont parcel, and he had said, the timing is good, and I had said, let's do it, and I had begun the process that ended 4 months later at a gift table at Michael and Diane's wedding reception. The Vermont parcel was 4 acres, and it had a structure on it that needed work, and it sat adjacent to a conservation area, and it had appreciated significantly in the 3 years since I had first identified it, and I had been watching it, and waiting for the right moment. And the right moment turned out to be Michael's wedding, because Michael and Diane had said they wanted to build a home eventually, and they had mentioned Vermont specifically twice in my presence, and I had been listening. The way I always listen, which is carefully and without appearing to. And I had purchased the parcel, and I had transferred it into Michael and Diane's names as a wedding gift, and I had put the deed in a card, and I had put the card in an envelope, and I had placed it on the gift table between a crystal serving set and a stand mixer, and I had gone to get champagne, and I had waited. The waiting lasted 4 hours because gift opening at receptions happens late, and I had spent those 4 hours watching Barbara circulate and compliment Diane's family and tell anyone who would listen what a beautiful match this was, and I had eaten dinner and danced with Tom and talked to people I liked, and at 9:15, Barbara gathered the family around the gift table and began the opening, and she went through the large boxes first and the beautiful wrapped things, and when she got to the envelope, she held mine up and said, oh, look, it's from Claire. And the comment came, and the laugh came, and the envelope opened, and the deed fell out. And Barbara read it and read it again, and her sister said, what is it? And Barbara said, it's a property deed, and I watched Michael take it from his mother's hands and read it, and Michael said, Claire. And I said, congratulations, Michael. And he said, this is 4 acres in Vermont, and I said, it is. And he said, how? And I said, I work in land acquisition. Michael I have for 10 years, and Diane had come over and she was reading over Michael's shoulder, and she said, Claire, this is where we talked about building. And I said, I know. And she looked at me and she said, you remembered, and I said, I listen. And Tom was standing next to me and he put his arm around me, and Barbara was still holding the card the deed had come from. And she said, Claire, I didn't know you worked in this, and I said, I know, Barbara. And she said, this is a very significant gift, and I said, I hope they love it, and she said, I had no idea, and I said, I know. And I let those 3 words be everything they needed to be, without adding anything to them, because Barbara had communicated for 4 years through the careful architecture of small comments. And I had communicated back in one envelope, and I thought that was a fair exchange. And Tom squeezed my shoulder, and I finished my champagne, and Michael and Diane came and hugged me, and Diane said, I want to know everything about how you found this, and I said, come to dinner next week, and she said, absolutely. And Barbara stood at the gift table for a while after everyone had moved away, and I did not go to her, and she did not come to me, and that was fine. And at Christmas that year, she asked me about my work for the first time in 4 years, and I told her about it, and she listened, and she did not say anything dismissive, and that was as close to an apology as Barbara was going to get, and I accepted it as one, and we have been in a different place since that gift table. And I think the envelope did more in 30 seconds than 4 years of conversation could have. And I think that is because some things have to be seen to be believed. And Barbara needed to see, and now she has.